In a world where technology is rapidly evolving and every day we're presented with new and improved tools for training recovery, it's important to understand the principles that underpin the process because no matter what your goal is, the most optimal training program will be rendered effectively useless without the environment that facilitates the recovery you need. In this video, we're going to have a look at those principles that underpin the recovery process, the big rocks of recovery that are the most important aspects to tick off, and then maybe have a discussion about some of the more nuanced aspects of recovery that can be useful in the long run. For the purposes of this video, we're predominantly talking about recovery across a training week or training cycle standpoint, not necessarily in a in-between sets scenario. So we'll do a more in-depth video looking at intra-session, i.e. between sets recovery at some point, but for now we're looking more at the broader recovery process. Humans are a complex and dynamic adaptive system that, under the right circumstances, has an almost limitless capacity for adaptation. The training process, broadly speaking, involves the deliberate application of stress to the system in order to drive adaptation in the direction that we're looking for. This is known as allostasis, and it's a hardwired survival mechanism that is about ensuring you are effectively allocating the resources that you have in a way that is most suited to ensuring your survival in the environment that you live in. Before we talk too deeply about recovering from training, it's worth ensuring that you're doing the right kind of training to suit the goals that you have. The adaptive process that we're talking about is specific to the stress placed upon the system. This is referred to as the SAID principle, specific adaptation to implied demand. Essentially, you get better at the things you train because regular exposure to those stresses promotes the growth and adaptation that you need in order to continue to improve. This is also part of the reason that we can't do the same weight over and over and continue to expect our strength to improve, because your body is trying to become more efficient over time, and at a certain point, by applying the same stimulus continually, your body no longer recognizes it as a threat and therefore doesn't need to reallocate resources in order to drive further adaptation. Once you've ensured you're doing the right kind of training, the next and probably most important step in ensuring you can recover well from that training is to make sure that you're doing the right amount of training. Not enough, and you end up with a stimulus that isn't sufficient to actually drive any progress. And too much training, your body can't facilitate the recovery it needs, and ultimately you'll see a decrease in your performance. There are a lot of factors that go into influencing the amount of training that you can effectively recover from, and to go too deeply into those would be beyond the scope of this video. We'll do a separate video at some stage on talking more about the factors that influence how much training you can and should be doing, but for now it's just important to recognize that the most effective tool for ensuring you can recover well from training is making sure that you're doing the right amount of training. Over time, experimenting with more load or less load, more volume or less volume can be really useful in ensuring that you're working from starting at your minimum effective dose and being able to increase from there. Because ultimately, arbitrarily adding more training for the sake of it isn't necessarily the most effective tool, because eventually you get to a point where you can no longer recover from the work that you're doing. With a well thought out and well managed training program accounted for, we next turn to fueling the training process. Again, an in-depth discussion of the nuances of nutrition is beyond the scope of this video, but we'll touch on the basics. First and foremost, it's important to ensure that you're getting sufficient calories to fuel the work that you're doing. There are a myriad of different ways to account for the total number of calories that you might need, but like most things, experimenting with a base level first and tracking both your calorie intake and your body weight changes is the most effective method. Once you've got your calories sorted, the next most important step in the nutrition puzzle is your protein intake. Protein provides the amino acid building blocks we need to repair the damage that is induced by training, and insufficient protein intake can often lead to increased muscle soreness and decreased performance over the long term. Most of the nutrition research puts the ideal protein intake window somewhere between 1.4 grams and 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of body mass per day. Like most things, you're going to need to experiment a little bit with what this looks like for you. There are some factors that put you towards the lower end, including a lower training age, less muscle mass, or mostly animal sources for your protein. And then those with higher muscle masses, a higher training age, or who are eating predominantly plant sources should probably end up towards the higher end of that spectrum. As I said before, experimenting here is the most important part, and once you've got your calories and protein down pat, the rest becomes a little bit more about what you like to eat. When it comes to specific nutrition advice, again, beyond the scope of this video, but if you need more guidance, come and talk to us and we'll happily point you in the direction of people more qualified than I am to give you specific nutritional advice for your circumstances. Having covered total training load and nutritional intake, the next most important aspect of your recovery is sleep. Sleep is the ultimate performance enhancer because it's free, easily accessible, and all it really requires is time. We've all heard the number of 8 hours of sleep be thrown around as the gold standard for sleep for everyone. And the reality is, like many things, that's not always the case. Here's a cool graph to look at the sleep demands of a recreational athlete versus a more competitive athlete. And as you can see, like with most things, there's a window in which your individual demands will exist. And as you become more competitive and more serious about your training and become more advanced in terms of your total training age and muscle mass, things like that, your total sleep requirement will increase. Ensuring that the quality of the sleep that you're getting is as high as can be, and ensuring that you're getting enough sleep is the really important part. We'll do a separate video at some stage on factors that influence your ability to sleep well, sleep hygiene and routines around that. But for now, know that getting more sleep is probably going to be more effective in improving your recovery from training than just about any other tool you have. Final point to make when looking at the big rocks of training recovery is stress management. This one's a little harder to quantify, especially when we're talking about the average person walking into a gym to train to be fitter and stronger and healthier. You're probably not a professional athlete, which means you've probably got bills to pay, a job to worry about, perhaps a relationship to maintain, or maybe even kids. Now, the easy answer to this is to quit your job, abandon your family, and escape into the woods, build yourself a cabin, fit out the ultimate training facility, and then never have to worry about minimizing your gains because of your fussy children or your silly job. For those of you that don't have that luxury, instead, we need to look at living a life that allows you to manage your stress as effectively as possible while still meeting your obligations as an adult. Ensuring that you have dedicated relaxation time built into your week to do the things that make you happy is the easiest way to do this. Adding more training in for the sake of it's probably not going to help if what that means is you're adding more stress to the overall system, because in the end, your brain can't necessarily differentiate between the emotional stress of managing a stressful job and a life and the physical stress induced by training really hard. If you have dedicated time within your week to do the things that make you happy, whether that's reading a book, playing video games, or going outside for a walk, doesn't really matter. The actual modality itself is less relevant than that you have dedicated time to relax and let your body do the recovery and repair that it needs to continue to make progress in training. Having now looked at the 4 big rocks of recovery, being managing your training load, your nutritional intake, sleep, and stress management and/or relaxation, we can now have a bit more of a discussion about some of the more common tools and hacks you might see on Instagram and elsewhere that claim to radically improve your recovery or facilitate some great increase in performance. In case you haven't already picked up on it by now, the reality of these things is that they are really just icing on the cake. Nothing will ever compare to nailing the 4 big rocks and ensuring all of that is accounted for before you start investing in tips, tricks, and hacks you find on Instagram. Speaking of Instagram, here's a great graph I found from Dr. Peter Turney, I think it is, that shows you the relative cost benefit and recovery improvements you get from a range of different things. As you'll see in this graph, most of the things we've talked about so far are a long way down the benefit scale and highlighted in green. Most of the more common modalities that you'll see touted as the one key hack to improving your training recovery and performance on Instagram, you'll see in this graph are in that orange and yellow phase, where they don't necessarily provide a great benefit, they probably won't do any specific harm, but they often come at a cost. And as we've kind of established at this point, if you're not already ticking the big boxes, then spending that money might not be the most effective allocation of resources because you're basically pouring it down the toilet. Instead, focus your time and energy on those big rocks, and then if you've still got the room to move and you want to chase those 1%ers, then you can spend the money in an effective way. I hope what we've covered in this video helps you identify some key areas in your training process that may be lacking and may deserve a little bit more time and effort. And if you still really like spending money on toys, I hope you can better allocate the money to toys that might be more effective and useful while still ensuring that you're ticking those big boxes. Because in the end, no tool or hack or fancy new percussion tool is going to make your life any better than if you were to eat better, manage your stress, sleep more, and more effectively manage your training week.